Chapter 19, Cardiac Anatomy, Screencast 1, an Introduction. The first thing that we need to address here is the cardiovascular system. So we are actually now moving on to the homeostatic systems that we will be covering in this course. A couple of things to keep in mind about the cardiovascular system. One, of all the homeostatic systems, it is the only one that is completely enclosed in the body and has no openings to the outside environment. That's going to be important. If we look at the primary structures that make up the cardiovascular system, it is the heart and blood vessels. I personally have heard the term circulatory system used, but I prefer cardiovascular because it gives us more of an idea of the structures that are actually involved. When we look at the primary functions that are associated with the cardiovascular system, transport is the first that comes to mind. Now, one thing to keep in mind when we're talking about transport involves delivery, but it also involves picking up of metabolic waste. Generally, we think about transport and we think of delivery and exchange. Another term that we need to introduce here is the term perfusion. And perfusion is about the delivery of blood per gram of tissue, generally mils per minute per gram. One of the things that the heart has to do is maintain adequate perfusion. If the heart's not capable of this, the tissue is not going to get the blood that's necessary to maintain life. Now, the other thing that we have to introduce here are the vessels that make up the cardiovascular system. We will come back to this when we start chapter 20. Arteries are generally defined as any blood that is transporting blood away from the heart. Veins are transporting blood back to the heart, and capillaries are actually exchange vessels. Now, this particular slide is broken down into three major components. The first is indicating that the heart is actually two pumps, and we can see that here. We have a right side and a left side, and on each side we're going to find atria and ventricles. Keep in mind these are internal structures. We can only see the atria and the ventricles from an internal view of the heart itself. When we look at the right side of the heart, it is receiving blood that has been deoxygenated. It will then move on to the right ventricle, and then it will be pumped into the pulmonary circulation. Then, from the lungs, it will move back to the left heart and the left atrium, down into the left ventricle, and then out to the rest of the body or the systemic circulation. So here we really look at two pumps, a right pump and a left pump, but at the same time, remember, it is a very coordinated system. Atria will contract simultaneously, whereas ventricles will contract simultaneously. Atria will always contract prior to ventricular contraction. The second panel here is actually showing us the great vessels of the heart, and we can see veins and arteries. On the right side, we see the two vena cava, superior and inferior. And remember, these are returning deoxygenated blood to the right side of the heart. If we look at the pulmonary trunk, I want to take a step here, okay? Now, generally, when we look at the color coding, blue is going to indicate deoxygenated, and red is indicating oxygenated. This is important to keep in mind. But now, the pulmonary trunk is an artery. It is leaving the right ventricle. It is carrying deoxygenated blood, and that is why it is depicted the color blue. The pulmonary artery is the only arteries in the body that are carrying deoxygenated blood. If we look at the left side, we are going to see the pulmonary veins. Remember, veins return blood back to the heart, but since these veins are coming from the lung to the left atria, they are oxygenated. That is why they are colored red. If we look at the aorta, that is receiving blood from the left ventricle and is responsible for moving blood into the systemic circulation. The last panel here is actually looking at valves. There are two sets of valves. On the right side, we are going to find the right atrioventricular valve, and that separates the right atrium from the right ventricle. We are also going to see the pulmonary semilunar valve, and this is the valve that's separating the right ventricle from the pulmonary trunk. On the left side, we have the left AV valve, and that is between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And we also have the aortic semilunar valve, which is separating the left ventricle and the aorta. One thing that I want to address here is really the function of the heart. All the heart really does, it generates a pressure gradient. Valves open and close based on differences in pressure on either side of the valve. Blood will move from high pressure to low pressure through valves that are open. That really is exactly what the heart is doing. Now, this particular figure is demonstrating the two circuits that we have. Remember, the right heart is responsible for moving blood through the pulmonary circuit, whereas the left heart is responsible for moving blood through the systemic circuit. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind here. Okay? Our ventricles will contract in a manner that we consider to be matched. What that means, when the ventricles contract, the same amount of blood will be leaving each ventricle. This is in spite of the fact that the ventricles are very different in size, with the left ventricle having a much thicker muscular wall. And that makes sense, though. You need to create a greater force that is going to move blood through the systemic circulation. The right heart only has to move blood through the lungs and back to the left heart. So it does not need as much of a muscular wall as the left ventricle. It's going to generate less pressure, but at the same time, remember, both of these ventricles are ejecting the same amount of blood basically whenever they contract. Keep this in mind. This is without a chip. There are no gauges, nothing. This is something that the hearts are just set up to do on their own. Now, there are a couple of clinical situations that are specific to heart function. The first that we're going to look at is what is referred to as congestive heart failure. And if we think about the terminology, failure, basically an indication that the heart is having problems pumping blood. And a result of that could be edema or swelling. And it is a very cardinal sign of congestive heart failure. Now, depending upon the side of the heart that's failing, it is going to impact where we see swelling and edema. Systemic edema will be a result of right ventricular impairment. So now we have more blood that's going to be remaining in the systemic circulation. And what ends up happening here, we're going to look at more fluid actually entering the interstitial space, that space between cells or the internal environment, and this results in swelling and edema. Pulmonary edema will occur if the left ventricle is impaired. Now, blood is going to remain in the pulmonary circulation as it is not leaving the heart due to the impaired function. Now, we're actually going to have swelling and fluid accumulate within the lungs. This is going to result in significant difficulties breathing, and also it is going to impair gas exchange. Now, when we look at the positioning of the heart is positioned in the thoracic cavity. It's going to be in a sac called the pericardium. And there's also going to be a subdivision called the mediastinum, which is between the lungs, and that is where the heart is actually sitting. One thing to remember here, the heart is actually tilted a little bit with the inferior portion going to the left side of the body. Now, there are some terminology that doesn't make a lot of sense when we're talking about the heart. Now, the base, what we need to remember here, the base would be what we consider when the great vessels are lopped off of the heart and you have that superior surface. The apex, that is going to be the inferior or pointy end, and that is the end that is pointing towards the left side of the body. Now, the heart, as we indicated previously, is in a sac known as the pericardium. I like to think of it as actually 2 layers and not necessarily 3. We are going to merge or fuse the fibrous and parietal pericardium together. Okay? And keep in mind what's happening here. We're going to be attaching to the diaphragm and base of aorta, the pulmonary trunk, and really what's happening here is going to anchor and prevent the heart from overfilling. Now, the parietal, it's attaching to the fibrous pericardium. So you can see here, since the parietal is attached to the fibrous, we might as well think of them as a single layer. Then we're going to have the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, and this is a layer that is attached directly to the heart. Think viscera, think organ. So it is on the heart itself, and between the parietal layer of the serous pericardium and the visceral layer, we're going to have a pericardial cavity. And within this cavity is a serous fluid, and the primary function here is to minimize friction as the heart is contracting. Now, there is a clinical view known as pericarditis, and whenever we see the term itis, we want to keep in mind we are referring to an inflammatory disease. This particular condition can be created by a number of causes, typically fungal, bacterial, or viral. Regardless, what happens, there's an accumulation of fluid in the pericardial cavity. So now it becomes what we consider to be a real space as it continues to fill with fluid. The issue here is this fluid may restrict the movement of the heart and actually prevent the chambers of the heart from filling. This also is known as cardiac tamponade, in which the heart is unable to pump. Sometimes one of the things that a physician may look for when they're listening to the heart is a friction rub. And so this would be a crackling sound that's heard through a stethoscope as the pericardial layers rub against each other.